Thanks, Brother Jamin. And good morning, everyone. It's not often you step onto the platform and the recorder encourages a mass walkout, but I guess I'll get used to it. Yesterday, as Brother Jamin's already reminded us, we talked about this key principle that Jesus is trying to communicate to his disciples. And that key principle is that God saves through death and resurrection. And that principle's right through the Bible. It starts obviously back in Genesis chapter 3 with the death of the lamb and Adam and Eve walking alive out of the Garden of Eden. So God saves through death and resurrection. Everyone who is saved has to go through this process, including Jesus and the nation of Israel. And a lot of John chapter 10 to 12 is Jesus preparing his disciples for this. So as we know, the Jews traditionally understood that their Messiah would be a saving king, and the future of their nation was sort of established and was going to go on forever. Their understanding didn't include this idea of death and resurrection. They expected a Messiah would come along on a white horse with a great big sword, some mighty warrior that was going to defeat the Romans and establish Israel as the head of nations in an everlasting kingdom. They didn't expect a Messiah who was crucified by the Romans. They didn't expect the crushing of their own nation by the same hated Romans and the domination of the Promised Land by Gentile powers for 1900 years. That was not part of the disciples' expectations at this time. So, as we saw yesterday, or began to see, the death and resurrection of Lazarus in chapter 11 is a prophecy about Israel, the death and resurrection of the Jewish nation. So Lazarus' death is not prefiguring Christ's own death, but Israel's. But what about Christ himself, the man we've come to think about and meditate on this morning? Unlike the nation of Israel, his death is only days, not decades away. How does he prepare his disciples for this shattering event? How does he make sure that his death is not surprising, it's not destroying of his disciples' faith, but affirming for their faith? It helps their faith grow. And John chapter 10 is how he does it. John chapter 10 is Christ trying to prepare his disciples for what's about to happen to him personally and to them personally as they watch these events unfold over the next days and weeks. Now, the trouble with working backwards in John is that each chapter flows on from the one before, and theoretically we could find ourselves tracking John's ideas and themes right back to chapter 1, but you'll be pleased to know in the interest of time that we won't be doing that this morning. But the discussion of chapter 10 flows on directly from the events of chapter 9. So if you turn back a page or back a column and just have a quick look at John chapter 9 and pick up some ideas from there. So what happens in John chapter 9? Well, in short, much to the annoyance of the Jews and particularly the Pharisees, a blind man gets healed. And the Jews are so annoyed by this obvious display of God's power evident in Jesus that they threw this healed man out of the synagogue. So have a look at John chapter 9 and verse 22. John 9 verse 22, these words spake his parents, so they say, don't ask us who healed our son. He is of age, ask him, he shall speak for himself. And they spake these words because, in verse 22, they feared the Jews. For the Jews had agreed already that if any man did confess that he was Christ, he should be put out of the synagogue. And in verse 33, the blind man, does make a confession of faith and is, pretty scathing of the Pharisees. He says, if this man, as in Jesus, were not of God, he could do nothing. So obviously, you guys don't know what you're talking about. And the Jews, true to their word, throw him out of the synagogue. In verse 34, they answered and said unto him, thou wast altogether born in sins, which reflects the disciples' question in the first verse of that chapter. Thou wast altogether born in sins, dost thou teach us? And they cast him out. And then in verse 35, Jesus heard that they'd cast him out, and when he had found him, he said unto him, Dost thou believe on the Son of God? Now notice that phrase that's come up a few times in those verses that we read, cast him out. And it's repeated there in verse 34 and verse 35. And the Greek word for that phrase is the word ekballo. So we've got the Greek ek, meaning out of, and ballo, which means to throw, from which we get ball and ballistics and that sort of thing. So ekballo is that idea of being cast out. So keep that word ekballo in mind for John chapter 10. So John chapter 10 then is the Jesus' dissertation on the Good Shepherd, as we know. And John chapter 9 has given us a good picture of the men that should have been the shepherds of Israel, the Pharisees. They were sort of at the top of the Jewish religion of the time. And John 9 shows us how they treat their sheep, especially a sheep like the blind man, or the man who had been blind, who clearly showed them that they were in error. Their solution? Throw the sheep out. The synagogue, the ecclesia, was not operated to save the sheep, it was operated for the benefit of the shepherds. So what sort of shepherds were these men, these Jews and Pharisees? Well, they're the same types of shepherds that Ezekiel had described in Ezekiel 34. So come back to this classic chapter of Ezekiel, Ezekiel 34, and we'll see how Ezekiel describes the leaders of the nation in his day. And we'll see really the sort of Old Testament basis for the events and dissertation of John chapter 9 and 10. Now, as you're turning back there, you'll notice the position of this chapter in the book of Ezekiel. It's chapter 34. Tuck that away for later, for next study in fact, because after Ezekiel 34 comes Ezekiel 35, and then 36 and 37 and 38. And after John 10, in logical mathematical progression, comes John 11 and John 12. So just keep that in mind. Ezekiel 34, verse 1. And the word of Yahweh came unto me, saying, Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say unto them, Thus saith the Lord Yahweh unto the shepherds. Woe be to the shepherds of Israel that do feed themselves. Should not the shepherds feed the flocks? So the focus of these shepherds, these leaders of Israel in Ezekiel's time, is on themselves. They're doing it for what they can get out of it. It's definitely not on the sheep. The ecclesia was there for their benefit. Verse 3, ye eat the fat, and you can't, eat the fat without killing the sheep, as we all know from the Merchant of Venice. Ye eat the fat, and ye clothe you with the wool. Ye kill them that are fed, but ye feed not the flock. The diseased have ye not strengthened, neither have ye healed that which was sick. So in John chapter 9, the Pharisees couldn't heal the man that was blind, and along comes a shepherd and does heal him. But of course, that's all just emblematic or symbolic of the fact that they couldn't heal anyone spiritually either. The important healing was spiritual, not physical. Verse 4 again, neither have ye bound up that which was broken, neither have ye brought again that which was driven away. So, brought again that which was driven away. As John chapter 9 tells us, they did the driving away. They were driving the sheep out of the synagogue. They did the driving away. They certainly weren't bringing again the sheep back into the synagogue. Neither have you sought that which was lost, but with force and with cruelty have you ruled them. So, as soon as they become uncomfortable with someone, they throw them out of the synagogue. That's their way of dealing with it. And we can contrast the shepherd who, leaves the 99 and goes and collects the one lost sheep in the parables of Christ. And verse 5, they, that is, God's sheep, were scattered because there is no shepherd, and they became meat to all the beasts of the field when they were scattered. But what's God's approach? Well, it's exactly the approach of his son, as we'd expect, who went to find the man cast out of the synagogue, as we read in John chapter 9. So down in verse 11 of Ezekiel 34, here's God's approach to his sheep. For thus saith the Lord Yahweh, behold, I, even I, will both search my sheep and seek them out. Too many S's. Search my sheep and seek them out. So words echoed in John chapter 9, verse 35, Jesus found the man who had been cast out, the blind man. Verse 12, as a shepherd seeketh out his flock in the day. And that idea of in the day is reflected in John chapter 11, verse 9, just as a side note. That he is among his sheep that are scattered. So will I seek out my sheep and will deliver them out of all places where they've been scattered in the cloudy and dark day. So Ezekiel 34 describes the shepherds of his day. Such were the shepherds of Ezekiel's day, and such were the shepherds of Israel in Jesus' day. The men who are supposed to lead God's people. So come back to John chapter 10 and we find how Jesus describes them in his dissertation on the same subject. John chapter 10 and verse 1, Jesus describes these shepherds. So in verse 1 he says, they're thieves and they're robbers. In verse 5 he says they're strangers. In verse 10 he says they were thieves come to steal and kill. And in verse 12 they're hirelings who flee from the sheep at the first sign of threat to their person. They're not their sheep. Who cares what happens to them? They don't own them. And they run away whenever a threat comes to the synagogue. But the Good Shepherd is different, isn't he? And there is only one Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherd is what we might call a counterintuitive shepherd. He's an illogical shepherd. I mean, stop and think about for a moment why you would become a shepherd of sheep. What would motivate you, speaking naturally, to become a shepherd? Surely it's so that you can get some wool and meat from the sheep. You should care for the sheep, sure, but it's your natural motivation is that so that one day the sheep are actually going to feed you. They'll give their life for you, in fact, one day, preferably in the form of a nice roast dinner. But what does the Good Shepherd do? He's counterintuitive, isn't he? He's not a natural shepherd. Verse 10, he gives his life to the sheep. So verse 10 says, I am the door, by me if any man enter in, he shall be saved, and shall go in and out and find pasture, in verse 9. And then verse 10, the thief cometh to not but for to steal and to kill and destroy. I am come that they might have life, and that they might have it more abundantly. He gives life to the sheep. He doesn't take the life of the sheep, he gives them life. And in verse 15, I lay down my life for the sheep. I lay down my life for the sheep. It's not just some sort of abstract life, some power that he gets from God that he gives to the sheep. It's his own life that he gives to the sheep. So the Good Shepherd, surely, naturally speaking, got it round the wrong way. He's not a logical shepherd. He's a counterintuitive shepherd. The shepherds of Israel were motivated by what they could get out of the sheep. This shepherd is motivated by what he can give to the sheep. And it's that difference in motivation that's really the foundation, the key here. Christ laid down his life for his sheep. That's his motivation. He gave up his life. He dedicated his entire life to the benefit, to the salvation of others. At no point in 3.5 years or 33.5 years did Jesus come first for Jesus. He didn't live for Jesus. He lived for others. He lived for us. The principle, not my will, but thine, ruled his entire mortal life. He laid down his life for his sheep during those mortal years, in dedicating his life to teaching and to serving others. The Jewish shepherds, they're motivated purely by self. They lived their own life to the fullest. They were only interested in living to their own life. They were filling themselves up with their pride and their achievements and the wealth and the material possessions they could get out of that life. They lived for themselves. And this gets to our key principle again. God saves through death and resurrection. And the first death that has to happen is the death of our own pride and selfishness. The Pharisees were never going to voluntarily submit to self-denial over self-elevation. So they would never receive life and salvation. And we're going to see that idea repeated through these studies. Unless we can lay down our own life, the life of Sam Mansfield, unless we can lay that down, unless we can kill that, we're never going to get resurrected to newness of life through the waters of baptism, as Paul says in Romans 6. And we're going to see, as I said, this idea repeated through these studies. This is the key moral principle that comes out of this. And salvation of the sheep is the aim of the Good Shepherd. Again, verse 9 of John chapter 10. I am the door, by me if any man enter in, he shall be saved. So that we're entering into salvation. That's the aim of the Good Shepherd, is to save his sheep. Salvation is the aim. And shall go in and go out and find pasture. So life, salvation from sin and death for the sheep is the aim of the Good Shepherd. So when we read about the Good Shepherd in John chapter 10 and verse 3, for example, what do we see him doing? What's happening as you read through these words? What's the image in your mind? Verse 3 of John chapter 10 says, to him the porter openeth, and the sheep hear his voice, and he calleth his own sheep by name, and leadeth them out. So we probably see an image of a shepherd, standing at the door, calling his sheep by name, one by one, and leading them away from that great flock of sheep, which is sort of the world around us, separating his sheep from humanity generally to be part of his ecclesia, his disciples. Separation from the world, that's what it's all about? Well, no, it isn't. That's not what it's about. So note carefully what happens in the first 3 verses of John chapter 10. Verily, verily, I say unto you, he that entereth not by the door into the sheepfold, but climbeth up by some other way, the same is a thief and a robber. But he that entereth in by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the porter openeth, and the porter represents God, and the sheep hear his voice, and he calleth his own sheep by name, and leadeth them out. So there's a sheepfold. Some thieves and robbers have been entering into the sheepfold, and that's a clear reference to the scribes and the Pharisees, particularly at the previous chapter of John. But the true shepherd enters by the door, and the porter opens the door to him, and he calls his sheep and leads them out. He leads them out of the sheepfold. Not into the sheepfold, but out of the sheepfold. So what is this sheepfold from which the Good Shepherd is leading his sheep? So the word fold in sheepfold just means a yard, or weirdly, a palace. And it's used 12 times in the New Testament, and of those 12 times, 2 are in this chapter, and we'll see both of them shortly. So 2 are in this chapter out of 12, and of the remaining 10, 8 refer to the palace of the high priest, where Jesus was tried before his crucifixion. The fold, the yard, the palace from which Jesus is calling his sheep is, in the first instance, not the world in general, but the Jewish synagogues, the temple, the palace of the high priest, the existing Orthodox religion of his day. And verse 4 reinforces this idea. Verse 4 of John chapter 10, and when he putteth forth his own sheep, he goeth before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. So again, Jesus' sheep aren't going in to a sheepfold, he's putting them forth. They're headed out. And the Greek word for putteth forth, it's the Greek word ekballo, to throw out. Exactly the same word as cast in John chapter 9 and verse 34 and 35. And where had the previously blind man been ekballoed from in John 9 verse 34 and 35? He'd been ekballoed from the Jewish synagogue. The same thing that happened to the once blind man is going to happen to all my sheep, says the Good Shepherd. They're all going to be cast out, ejected from the synagogue. And at this time, it's not the Jews casting them out, it's Jesus himself removing them from the synagogue and the temples of the Jews. He puts them forth. He ekballos his sheep. Now, for Jesus' immediate disciples that were listening to these words, the message is that they have to leave behind the synagogue to follow him. And I think the parallel for us today is, for Jesus' disciples today, we'll have to leave behind the orthodox religion of the day to follow him. And we'll talk more about this on Thursday night. But the parallel between Jesus' disciples leaving Jewish orthodoxy and us leaving, as it were, Christian orthodoxy are, I think, pretty clear. And they really show the danger of moving back towards a more ecumenical approach to our ecclesias. So Jesus is saying in this section, I've come to do exactly what you did to the once blind man back in chapter 9. I've come to cast out my sheep, to cast them out of the synagogue. I've come to lead my sheep out of the established fold, out of the palace of the high priest. I've come to call my sheep out of Judaism. And all my disciples will need to go through what that healed blind man went through in order to be my disciples. You can't remain Jesus' disciple and remain in the Jewish sheepfold. Now, verse 16 makes it even clearer again, although the King James Version doesn't sort of help in its translation of verse 16. So in verse 16, Jesus says, other sheep I have, which are not of this fold. Them also must I bring, and they shall hear my voice, and there shall be one fold and one shepherd. So you'll notice that the word fold there appears twice in verse 16. It's actually two different Greek words. The first one, translated fold, is the same as the word in verse 1, that sheepfold, the yard or the palace of verse 1. But some of Jesus' sheep are, in the words of verse 16, not of that fold. They're not of the same fold that is referring to back in verse 1. In other words, they're not part of the Jewish synagogue. They're Gentiles. But as verse 16 says, they're still going to be part of his one fold. And that fold is a different word at the end of verse 16. That fold simply means a flock of sheep. Nothing to do with the yard that sheep are stored in. So they're going to be part of his one fold. That one flock is Jew and Gentile combined, obviously, as we understand now. So Jesus' flock is not part of the Jewish yard, not part of the palace of the high priest. There's only one flock. Some have been called from the Jewish yard, as it were, the synagogues, and others are going to be called that are not part of the Jewish yard. They're the Gentiles. So here's some more shocking news for Jesus' disciples. They were brought up, they believed that salvation was by law, and salvation was by association with the temple or the synagogue. They believed that the sort of epitome of religion was the Pharisees, with all their fanaticism about ritual and cleanliness on the outside, and apparent, again from the outside, righteousness. They couldn't conceive of a relationship with God, let alone salvation, that didn't involve adherence to a building of some sort, ideally a temple, or failing that, a synagogue. And now here's Jesus telling them that the Pharisees weren't the pinnacle of religion. They're terrible, self-centred, selfishly motivated shepherds, as bad as the shepherds in Ezekiel's day. Now here's Jesus telling them that not only did the temple, the palace of the high priest, the synagogue, not save them, but unless they came out of that system of things, unless they were ekballo, just like the blind man had been, from that system, they would not receive life. They would not receive salvation. Salvation was not going to be via association with the synagogue. Salvation was by association, direct association with the Good Shepherd. Salvation was going to be in following the Good Shepherd wherever he led them. And Jesus' flock is identified not by the building that they meet in, but by hearing him. And in the verse, the words of the hymn that we had first this morning, the idea of the shepherd leading the flock through, he doesn't lead them into your yard and pen them up in there. The amazing fact of God's protection is that he's leading them through the valley of the shadow of death, and he still protects them through there. They're out in the open, but they're with their shepherd, and it's him that's protecting them. So Jesus' flock is identified not by the building that they meet in, but by hearing him. So in verse 3, they hear his voice. And by following him, in verse 4, his sheep follow him. And the end of, or near the end of John chapter 10 really sums up our relationship with our shepherd. So have a look at verse 27 of John chapter 10. And this is how it works. This is our relationship with the shepherd we've come to remember this morning. My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me, and I give them eternal life. It really is very simple. Now, the Good Shepherd is not just the shepherd, is he? He's also, in this section, the door. So in verse 7, Jesus says, I am the door. And again in verse 9, he says, I am the door. So what's he the door to? Well, we've already looked at this in verse 9. But again in verse 9, it makes it pretty clear. I am the door. If any man, by me, if any man enter in, he shall be saved, and shall go in and out and find pasture. So you'll notice it's the door to salvation here. Men are not entering into the Jewish sheepfold by this door. They're entering into salvation. The Jewish sheepfold wasn't salvation, in other words. The thieves and robbers of verse 1 entered the sheepfold, but they entered it on the wrong basis, didn't they? Entered it on the basis of pride and selfishness. They stormed into the Jewish synagogue and they took whatever they could. But that's not the same as entering into salvation. The Jewish synagogues, even the law itself, as we know, could not save. But we enter salvation, and we enter salvation through the door, and the door is Jesus himself, as he's told us a couple of times in this chapter. But what did verse 2 say? He that entereth in by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. So the shepherd enters through the door, but Jesus is the shepherd, and Jesus is the door, but Jesus goes through the door too. How can he be the door and yet enter in through the door? It's almost, almost contradictory. It's quite confusing. They're pretty simple words, but they're the key to a very profound idea. Verse 9, again, as we've seen, makes it clear that the door is the route to salvation. I am the door, says Jesus. And I enter through the door, says Jesus, and that means that Jesus is both the method of salvation and he goes through that same process of salvation as his sheep. He's saved by the same method that we are saved. Once saved, once he goes through that door, he becomes the door. He becomes the method of salvation. He is both the door, or first he goes through the door, and then he becomes the door. Once saved, he becomes the method of salvation. And again, sort of the risk of getting a bit monotonous, death and resurrection is God's method of salvation. Jesus was saved through death and resurrection. Firstly, moral, and most importantly, moral. Death to his own nature, and then walking in newness of life during his 33 and a half years on earth. And then he demonstrated that in symbol, physically, on the cross, in the grave, and then raised literally to immortality. And we follow that pattern, don't we? We enter through the door that he has revealed to us. So if you were to, think about doors and think about salvation, and you're, a Jewish audience, as hear Christ's words of verse 9, where do you think your mind would go? I'm pretty sure if you thought about doors and salvation, your mind would go first to Exodus chapter 12. It would go to the Passover. So what happens in Exodus chapter 12? We're not sort of going to turn back there. I'm pretty sure you're all reasonably familiar with it. There's an angel of death coming. How do we escape the sword of that, judging angel? By painting the doorway of our house with the blood of a lamb. So by entering in through that bloody doorway, we could reach salvation. What's the principle? Death and resurrection. Sacrifice and life. The lamb, Christ is the Passover lamb, as we know, gives his blood, his life, so that we, the people in the house, can live. And of course, that's another paradox. He's the lamb, but he's also the good shepherd. He's numbered among the people that he came to save. He is saved through the same means of salvation, which is himself. Outside the house is death. Inside the house, through the door painted with the blood of sacrifice, a life poured out for others, is salvation. If we enter a doorway that doesn't have the blood of the Lamb on it, we are not entering salvation. Salvation is only through the principles of death and resurrection. I'm going to go through that door, says our Lord Jesus Christ, and then I will become the door through which we, his disciples, his sheep, can enter and be saved. How will I enter salvation? Asked Jesus. By laying down my natural, selfish life, by crucifying the flesh with its affections and lusts, by doing God's will instead of my own will. First in my daily life, and then symbolically on the cross. And when I've done that perfectly, I expect my sheep to follow me through that same door. The door of laying down your life, your pride, your selfishness, so that you can, instead of doing your own will, do God's will. So that you can serve your fellow sheep, just like I did. And that's what this morning is about, isn't it? Jesus shared the bread and the wine with his disciples at the Last Supper, and so set a pattern for us to follow. The wine is his blood. The bread is his flesh. The same principles that saved him save us. He set the path and we follow. So in verse 4, Jesus goeth before them. This idea of him going first and us following is established back there in verse 4. He treads the path of salvation and expects us to follow. And in verse 4 again, his sheep do follow him. Verse 5, they don't follow strangers. Verse 27, as we've read, they follow me. We follow him through that same door, which is himself. He didn't do it so that we don't have to do it. He did it to give us a pattern to follow. And what's that pattern? The pattern is a life of sacrifice, a life not living to ourselves, but living to God and to others. 1 Peter 2, verse 21 to 25 really sums it up, doesn't it? For even hereunto were ye called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that ye should follow his steps, who did no sin, neither was guile found in his mouth, who when he was reviled not again, when he suffered, he threatened not, but committed himself to him that judgeth righteously, who his own self bare our sins in his own body on the tree, that we, being dead to sins, should live unto righteousness, by whose stripes ye were healed. For ye were as sheep going astray, but are now returned unto the shepherd and bishop of your souls. So it's easy enough to follow Christ, isn't it, when he's the Messiah that we expect, when he's the shepherd that we expect. You know, Jesus' own disciples, Peter and Andrew, and even Judas, were keen to follow him when they thought that he was going to overthrow the Romans in a show of strength and establish the kingdom of God on earth. But what about when he's not? What about when his life is not one of kingship, but one of sacrifice? Can we still follow him then? What about when he is a man who dedicates his whole life to others? Can we still follow him then? What about when his life is not one of pride or of self-elevation or of demonstrations of power, but of humility? Can we follow him then? And can we follow, even more importantly, not just his actions, but his motivation? And the key difference between the Messiah the disciples were expecting, between the leaders that they already had, and Jesus Christ himself. Why did he do it? Verse 10, I am come that they might have life. Verse 11, why did he do it? For the sheep. Verse 13, for the sheep. Verse 15, for the sheep. His motivation is to do it for others. And if we can get that motivation right, putting ourselves last, elevating others, acting out of agape love, love without a cause, our actions will follow. We will follow him, and he will give us his life, eternal life.